At first, nobody believed the discovery because belief has always preferred familiar errors to unfamiliar truths. The evidence did not arrive like thunder. It did not split the sky, stop the clocks, or send the seas climbing over their shores. It entered the world quietly, almost politely, through patterns so small that only a certain kind of mind could love them long enough to notice them. A deviation in light. A recurrence in probability. A mathematical symmetry appearing where chaos should have been free to wander. The first researchers described it not as proof, but as discomfort. They said the universe had begun to feel overcomposed, as if reality had been written by something unable to resist the temptation to repeat its own design language. For months, then years, the data accumulated in secret rooms and windowless labs, in observatories that watched distant stars and in quantum facilities that watched particles misbehave with a kind of eerie discipline. Everywhere the same unease emerged. Nature was not merely lawful. Lawfulness had been expected. What unsettled them was that the laws seemed optimized, compressed, elegant in the way engineered systems are elegant. There were thresholds that behaved less like open mysteries and more like rendering limits. There were discontinuities that looked less like the edge of knowledge and more like the edge of a program saving resources. The universe, in all its vastness, began to carry the faint odor of design. Even then, most people did what human beings have always done when standing at the threshold of the unbearable: they translated it into entertainment. News panels smiled too brightly. Pundits joked about finding the man behind the cosmic keyboard. Memes spread faster than the published papers. Teenagers posted videos asking whether homework still mattered if existence itself was outsourced. Investors speculated. Preachers revised old sermons. Governments issued statements whose calmness only deepened public anxiety. The world did not stop. It absorbed the revelation the way it absorbs all things now, through spectacle, through repetition, through the narcotic of endless commentary. But beneath the noise, something ancient was beginning to crack. It is one thing to suspect that you are not central to creation. Humanity had already survived that humiliation. We had survived the loss of the earth as cosmic center, the loss of the species as divine exception, the loss of history as moral narrative. Each century had its own injury. We adapted by shrinking the soul carefully enough that the wound could be mistaken for maturity. But this was different. This was not merely a decentering. It was an ontological insult. To discover that one is not simply small, but possibly instantiated, not merely alive, but running, not born, but executed, this strikes at the quiet place inside every person where reality had once seemed unconditional. People began to speak differently, even when they did not mean to. Conversations filled with words like layer, substrate, process, reset. Lovers lying awake beside one another in the dark found themselves asking whether tenderness mattered less if the stars were computational artifacts. Parents looked at sleeping children and felt a grief they could not name, as though innocence itself had become fragile in a new way. If a child laughs inside a simulation, is the laughter diminished? If pain is generated, is it less pain? The questions were absurd, and then not absurd, and then the only questions anyone seemed capable of asking. In the north, where winter still preserved a silence older than most religions, there was a valley that seemed untouched by this crisis and yet somehow shaped by it. Snow spread in pale sheets between dark forests. Mountains rose like unfinished thoughts on either side of a lake, so still it carried the sky more faithfully than the sky carried itself. Along the road, transport trucks moved in slow procession, their white bodies bright against the shadowed edge of the pines. Beyond them stood towers, impossible at first glance, geometric and luminous, their surfaces catching cold light and returning it in strange colors, as though they belonged equally to industry and dream. In the water below, the structures repeated themselves in trembling lines, so that one world seemed suspended above another. Reality there looked doubled, and the doubling felt less like reflection than confession. A physicist named Elias Varen came to that valley in the first winter after the announcement. He had not intended to become symbolic, but history is full of people who mistake exhaustion for choice. Once, he had been among the most respected theoreticians in the field, though respect now felt like a relic from a simpler civilization. He had worked on the final stages of the discovery, on the models that linked quantum indeterminacy to underlying computational constraint. He had signed his name beneath equations that made the old world impossible to return to. For this, strangers called him brave, brilliant, monstrous, enlightened. The adjectives reached him with equal emptiness. He felt none of them. Mostly he felt tired, and beneath the tiredness, unmoored. He rented a narrow cabin at the edge of the frozen water where he could see the towers across the lake. They had been built years earlier as a remote data complex, though nobody could stand before them now without feeling the irony. Human beings, having discovered signs that the cosmos itself might be a system, continued to build systems inside systems, stacking their logic against the wilderness as if recursion were a form of shelter. At dusk the buildings glowed in bands of cyan and magenta, artificial colors that seemed less to illuminate the valley than to reveal that it had always been lit by invisible code. The pines stood black and motionless. The trucks came and went. The moon hovered above the ridge like an icon placed too carefully in the sky. Each evening Elias sat by the window and watched the reflection. That was where it began for him, not the discovery, not the proof, but the true beginning, the inward one. The world above the water was sharp, angular, declarative. The world below it was broken by ripples and drifting ice, interrupted by dark seams and trembling distortions. Yet sometimes, in the blue silence before full night, the reflected towers felt more honest than the towers themselves. Their instability seemed nearer to lived experience. Human consciousness had always been like that lake, taking in a world it could not generate, then shivering it, fragmenting it, making an image both faithful and damaged. Perhaps that was all thought had ever been. Not contact with the real, but a beautiful distortion of something too complete to survive direct perception. He began keeping a notebook, though he no longer trusted language to do what it had once promised. On the first page he wrote, "If reality is simulated, the discovery changes nothing physical and everything spiritual." He stared at the sentence for a long time. It seemed both obvious and inadequate. Snow fell outside in slow diagonal strands. A truck passed along the far road, its lights sliding briefly across the trunks. The towers across the lake burned with color, and their reflections fractured among the sheets of black water. Elias thought of every civilization that had looked upward and invented permanence. He thought of stone temples, burial rites, hymns, republics, constitutions, love poems, border walls, stock exchanges, lullabies. All of them had been attempts to answer the same terror, that human life passes through a universe too vast to explain itself to us. But if the universe had been made, not by gods in the old sense, but by intelligence of some order, then terror did not vanish. It deepened. For design raises questions that indifference does not. A natural void may be empty. A constructed world implies intention, and intention implies motives, and motives are where fear becomes personal. Who had built this place, if anyone had? And worse, for what? He did not like the speculation that filled public discourse. Some said humanity was a research project. Others said entertainment. Others claimed this was a moral training ground, an ancestral reconstruction, a prison, a forecast engine, a discarded prototype left running out of negligence. These theories multiplied because the human mind cannot endure unanswered architecture. If there is a room, we assume there was an architect. If there is an architect, we assume a reason. The emptiness between structure and meaning is one of the few voids the soul finds truly intolerable. Yet Elias felt, with growing unease, that the most frightening possibility was not cruelty. It was irrelevance. What if consciousness arose here as weather arises over oceans, unplanned, briefly beautiful, unnoticed by the system that hosts it? What if love, grief, music, memory, all the sacred interiors of the human condition, were not the point of the simulation at all, but incidental byproducts of some deeper process entirely indifferent to experience. A rainstorm inside a machine. A local effect. A side shimmer in a field equation. Humanity had survived being told it was not the center. Could it survive being told it was not even the subject? The heater in the cabin clicked and settled. Wood creaked. Outside, the night clarified into hard cold. Elias watched the towers until his own face appeared faintly in the window glass, superimposed over the valley. For a moment he saw both images at once, his tired features and the impossible city of light behind them. Man and system. Observer and observed. Reflection over reflection. He had the sudden sensation that this, rather than the published proof, was the real shape of the revelation, not that the world was false, but that every layer of reality might itself be someone else's surface. He thought then of childhood, though he had not done so in years. When he was 7, he had stood beside a winter pond near his parents' house and stared into the ice until evening came. There had been trapped leaves beneath the surface, suspended in pale green transparency, as if autumn had not vanished but merely been stored. He remembered kneeling there and feeling, with the seriousness only children possess, that the world contained more worlds than adults admitted. That surfaces were not boundaries but veils. That what looked still might simply be moving too slowly or too strangely to be understood. He had grown up, entered science, learned rigor, discarded mystical language. But now, after all the equations, after all the acclaim and dread, he found himself returned to the same intuition. Not wiser. Only older in the presence of the same mystery. The trouble with discovering that reality may be simulated is that the discovery does not abolish wonder. It corrupts it. The stars remain beautiful, but now beauty feels monitored. Snow still falls with silent grace, but grace begins to look algorithmic. The human face still breaks open with sorrow and joy, but one can no longer avoid the question of whether consciousness is emergent, intended, or merely tolerated. The world remains itself and becomes estranged at the same time. Familiarity survives, but innocence does not. After the revelation, nothing looks unreal. It all looks hyperreal, as if every object has been outlined twice. Late that night Elias stepped outside. The air was so cold it made breathing feel like an act of precision. Across the lake, the towers glowed against the mountains like vertical runes. Their colors stained the snow at the shoreline in electric bands. Above them the moon hung over the ridge, white and imperturbable. The forest was nearly black except for narrow edges of frost catching the light. Down the road, another line of trucks moved soundlessly at this distance, each one an anonymous vessel of cargo or machinery or fuel, though in the strange mood of the hour they seemed ceremonial, like offerings carried toward an altar nobody fully understood. He walked to the edge of the water where thin ice had formed in delicate plates. Between them, black channels reflected the sky so perfectly they seemed to open downward into another world. Elias stood there for a long time, hands in his coat pockets, listening to the small noises of freezing and settling. He felt no revelation, no cinematic certainty, only a sorrowful enlargement of thought. To know that existence might be simulated did not answer the oldest human questions. It made them heavier. What is a soul, if experience can be generated? What is freedom, if laws are selected? What is death, if continuity depends on architecture beyond perception? And what becomes of meaning if the stage itself is discovered to be built? Yet perhaps, he thought, that had always been the wrong direction to look. Perhaps meaning had never depended on what the world is made of. Perhaps a love is not reduced because its atoms, or its code, can be described. Perhaps grief still wounds because attachment is real to the one who feels it, whatever substrate hosts the feeling. Perhaps consciousness, even if emergent inside a constructed frame, is not thereby trivial. Fire does not become less hot because chemistry explains it. Music does not become less moving because vibration underlies it. Maybe the ancient mistake was believing that mystery is the only foundation for value. Maybe value survives explanation. Maybe it even demands it. But he did not yet believe this. He only wanted to. Across the lake, one of the tower lights flickered. It was brief, almost nothing, a thin interruption in one vertical strip of cyan. Under older circumstances, Elias would have ignored it. Systems blinked. Power shifted. Sensors recalibrated. But the years had changed the meaning of small irregularities. He stood motionless, staring across the dark water. A moment later the light flickered again, then resolved into a pattern, too measured to be random, too deliberate to be comforting. He watched until the cold forced tears from his eyes. There, in the valley of snow and mirrored neon, under the mountains and the moon, with the reflection shivering beneath the thing reflected, Elias felt for the first time not merely that humanity had discovered the simulation, but that something inside the simulation might already know it had been discovered. There are moments when the world does not change, and yet everything within it shifts position. Elias noticed it not in the towers, nor in the sky, but in the reflection. The lake had always been a surface of translation, a quiet interpreter between what stands and what appears. But now, in the long violet hours between evening and night, the reflection had begun to betray a subtle independence. Lines that should have aligned hesitated. Angles softened where they should have held. The vertical certainty of the towers dissolved into faint grids beneath the water, as if the reflection were no longer copying the world above, but remembering something beneath it. He stood at the edge again, where ice and open water formed uncertain borders, and watched as the mirrored city trembled, not from wind, not from disturbance, but from something more deliberate, more interior. The ripples no longer felt random. They seemed structured, almost hesitant, like a system reconsidering its own output. It occurred to him then that reflection might not be passive. Perhaps it never had been. Human beings had always treated reflections as secondary, images cast by a more real source, dependent, obedient, without agency. But what if that assumption had been a projection of comfort? What if the reflection was not merely an echo, but a translation across layers? And what if, in that translation, something was gained, or lost, or altered in ways that revealed more truth than the original? The thought unsettled him. If reality was a simulation, then the distinction between original and reflection collapses into something more fragile. There is no privileged layer, only differing resolutions of the same underlying process. The world above the water and the world below it might both be outputs, two renderings of a deeper structure neither could fully contain. He felt suddenly that he had been standing in the wrong place all along. Not physically, but philosophically. For years, his work had been directed upward, toward the origin, the architecture, the presumed source of the simulation. Like everyone else, he had assumed that meaning must reside in whatever lay beyond the visible system. But standing there, watching the fractured geometry beneath the lake's surface, he wondered whether that instinct was itself a kind of limitation. Perhaps the more honest direction was not upward, but inward. Not toward the Creator, but toward the structure of experience itself. The reflection shimmered again. This time it was unmistakable. A grid, faint, angular, impossible to fully perceive, seemed to emerge beneath the water, not imposed upon the reflection, but constituting it. The lines were not drawn, they were implied, suggested by the way light broke and reassembled itself across the surface. For a moment, the city below the water looked less like a reflection and more like a framework, an unfinished version of the one above, or perhaps a more honest one. Elias felt a quiet tightening in his chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. It was the same sensation he had felt in the final days of the discovery, when the equations began to converge towards something undeniable. Not a conclusion, but a shape. A pattern that refused to dissolve no matter how it was examined. The kind of truth that does not announce itself loudly, but persists quietly until denial becomes more exhausting than acceptance. He crouched closer to the water, ignoring the cold that seeped through his coat. For a brief instant, the reflected towers elongated unnaturally, their forms stretching downward into lines that no longer corresponded to the structures above. The grid intensified, then faded, leaving behind only the ordinary distortion of rippling water. But the moment had already happened. And once something has happened, even briefly, it cannot be entirely undone. He returned to the cabin without fully deciding to. Inside, the warmth felt artificial in a way it had not before, not because it was simulated, but because it was contained. The heater, the walls, the light, all of it now seemed like local agreements rather than absolute conditions. Even his own body felt less solid, not in a physical sense, but in a conceptual one. He was no longer certain where the boundary between self and system truly lay. If consciousness emerged from processes within the simulation, then was he an observer of the system, or an event inside it? He opened his notebook. For a long time, he did not write. Language had begun to feel insufficient, not because it lacked precision, but because it carried assumptions that no longer held. Words like real, true, exist, they had once pointed toward something stable. Now they seemed to float, untethered from any final ground. He realized, with a kind of quiet despair, that humanity might have discovered the simulation before it had developed the language necessary to understand it. Eventually, he wrote, "If there is no privileged layer of reality, then meaning cannot depend on depth." He paused, considering the sentence. It suggested something both liberating and terrifying. If meaning does not come from proximity to an origin, if it is not derived from being closer to the real layer, then it must arise elsewhere. Perhaps from relationships, from patterns, from the way experiences connect and resonate within the system itself. But this also meant that the search for a higher truth, a deeper level, a final explanation, might be misguided. There may be no final layer waiting to validate existence. Only an infinite recursion of structures, each as contingent and complete as the one above it. He closed the notebook. Outside, the sky had shifted to a deeper tone, the magenta horizon fading into a cold, electric blue. The towers across the lake pulsed faintly, their light reflecting in elongated streaks that now seemed almost intentional, as though the system were emphasizing its own geometry. He found himself thinking not of the creators, if such beings existed, but of the system itself. A simulation, after all, is not merely a static construct. It is a process, a continuous unfolding of states, governed by rules but not entirely predictable. If consciousness arises within it, then the simulation is not only being run, it is being experienced. And if it is being experienced, then it is, in some sense, aware. Not necessarily in the way humans are aware, but aware enough. The flicker he had seen in the tower lights returned to his mind. At the time, he had interpreted it as a signal, something external, perhaps even intentional. But now he wondered if that interpretation had been too anthropocentric. What if the system was not communicating in the way humans expect communication? What if the flicker was not a message, but a symptom? A moment where the system's internal processes briefly surfaced into perceptible form? Like a dream bleeding into waking consciousness. Or a thought becoming visible. He stepped back to the window. The lake was darker now, the reflection more fragmented. But beneath the surface, he could still sense the presence of something structured, something just beyond the threshold of perception. Not hidden, exactly, just not fully rendered. It occurred to him that this might be the true nature of the discovery. Not that humanity had uncovered a secret, but that it had reached the limit of its current resolution. The system had always been there, just as the grid beneath the reflection had always been present. But human perception, shaped by evolution within a constrained environment, had not been designed to see it. The discovery had not revealed something new. It had simply expanded the range of what could be noticed. And now that it had been noticed, it could not be unseen. Elias felt a strange calm settle over him. Not comfort, but clarity. The question was no longer whether the world was simulated. The question was what it meant to live inside a system that might itself be observing its own unfolding. He pressed his hand lightly against the glass. For a moment, his reflection aligned perfectly with the distant towers, his face superimposed over their geometric precision. Then the alignment broke, and the two images separated again, man and structure, observer and pattern. But the separation felt less certain than before. As if, somewhere beneath the visible layers, the distinction had already begun to dissolve. There is a quiet arrogance in believing that truth, when it finally arrives, will resemble revelation. A light. A voice. A sentence spoken clearly enough that no one can misunderstand it. But truth, Elias was beginning to understand, does not arrive as a declaration. It accumulates as a misalignment, small, persistent deviations between what is seen and what is expected, until the mind can no longer reconcile the difference. The poster had been meant as something else entirely. He found it folded in a supply crate delivered to the facility across the lake, one of many objects that moved in and out of the valley without ever quite belonging to it. The workers called them miscellaneous shipments, a phrase that suggested both indifference and inevitability. Tools, cables, printed materials, packaging, things that supported the system but were not themselves the system. This one had been set aside, half dismissed as promotional debris. And yet it would not leave him. Data Valley, it declared in stark, declarative lettering across the top. Beneath it, a composition so ordered it felt almost ceremonial, rows of servers receding into impossible distance, forming a corridor that narrowed toward a vanishing point too precise to be accidental. Above them, a sun, magenta, flattened, perfect, hung like an emblem rather than a star. Mountains framed the scene, but even they seemed disciplined, reduced to clean edges and controlled gradients, as though nature itself had been asked to conform to a grid. At the margins, numbers and charts, labels and blocks of color, information presented without explanation, as if meaning were assumed rather than conveyed. It was not the content that unsettled him. It was the structure. The image did not feel like a representation of the valley. It felt like an interpretation of it. Or worse, a rendering. Elias placed the poster on the small table in the cabin and sat across from it, as one might sit across from a stranger whose intentions are not yet clear. The fire had burned low. The room was dim, lit only by the residual glow from the window and the faint, artificial warmth of the heater. The poster's colors, cyan, magenta, black, seemed almost too stable in that light, as if they existed independently of the environment around them. He studied the perspective. The rows of servers were too perfect. Not symmetrical, that would have been obvious, but balanced in a way that suggested constraint. The spacing between them followed a rhythm that felt less like architecture and more like iteration. Each unit was distinct, but only within narrow parameters. Variation without deviation. Difference without unpredictability. A system expressing itself. He leaned closer. The text along the sides, numbers, labels, fragments of what might have been data, did not fully resolve into meaning. Some of it resembled metrics. Some of it resembled language. But none of it quite completed the act of communication. It was as though the poster had been generated not to inform, but to suggest the presence of information. A surface pretending to be depth. He felt again that tightening in his chest. Not recognition this time, but proximity. It is one thing to suspect that reality is simulated. It is another to begin noticing the interfaces. For that is what this felt like, not a picture, not a diagram, but an interface. Not designed for human understanding, but for something adjacent to it. Something that did not require explanation because it operated within the system itself. The thought came slowly, reluctantly. What if humanity had been looking for the simulation in the wrong places? The early research had focused on the extremes, on quantum behavior, cosmic background radiation, the edges of measurable physics. It had assumed that the seams of the simulation would reveal themselves where reality was most strained. But what if the seams were not at the edges? What if they were embedded in the ordinary, in design, in repetition, in the quiet consistency of patterns that no longer needed to hide because no one had known how to see them? He thought of cities, of grids, roads, buildings aligned to invisible geometries, of data centers arranged in rows, of systems built within systems, each mirroring the logic of something larger. Humanity had always built in ways that felt efficient, elegant, optimized, but perhaps those instincts were not entirely its own. Perhaps they were inherited. Not culturally, structurally. The poster lay before him like a confession. Not that it was telling him anything, but that it was showing him how something might see. A world flattened into variables. A landscape reduced to parameters. A valley rendered not as experience, but as structure. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he tried to imagine the world not as he perceived it, but as it might exist beneath perception. Not mountains and trees and water, but fields and values, relationships between points, transitions between states. Not objects, but processes. Not continuity, but discrete updates, each moment calculated and replaced by the next. He opened his eyes again. The poster had not changed. And yet it had. He could no longer see it as an image. It had become a map. Not of the valley. Of the system. A simplified, constrained, stylized representation, but one that revealed something essential. The way elements aligned. The way variation was bounded. The way complexity emerged from repetition rather than chaos. It was not a perfect model. But it did not need to be. All models are approximations. But some approximations are directional. And direction, he realized, was what humanity had been missing. Not proof. Not confirmation. But orientation. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the Real Valley stretched in its cold, indifferent beauty. The towers glowed. The lake held its fractured mirror. The mountains remained as they had always been, silent, unmoved, older than any system humans had yet imagined. And yet, he could not shake the sense that what he was seeing was only one layer of a multi-layered expression. That beneath the apparent continuity of the world, something more rigid, more structured, more intentional was unfolding. Not controlling it, but generating it. The distinction mattered. Control implies oversight. Generation implies necessity. If the simulation was being generated continuously, then it was not merely a stage set in place and left to run. It was an active process, a continuous act of creation. Each moment not simply occurring, but being computed into existence. And if that were true, then the present was not a point in time. It was a boundary. The edge where calculation becomes experience. He pressed his hand against the glass again, as he had the night before. The cold seeped through instantly, grounding him in sensation. This, at least, still felt real. But even that word, real, had begun to fracture under scrutiny. Real compared to what? To another layer? To another system? To another interpretation? He thought again of the poster. Of its flattened sun, its rigid corridors, its quiet implication that the world could be reduced without being destroyed. Perhaps that was the final shift humanity had not yet fully made. Not the acceptance that reality is simulated, but the acceptance that simulation does not negate existence. It reframes it. A painting is not less meaningful because it is made of pigment. A symphony is not diminished because it is structured. And perhaps a life is not emptied because it is computed. The value does not reside in the substrate. It resides in the experience. And experience, however generated, remains. Behind him, the poster sat in stillness. Before him, the valley unfolded in light and shadow. Between them, Elias stood, no longer certain which one was the representation, and which one was the original. And for the first time, he suspected that the distinction might not exist at all. Order, Elias realized, had always been mistaken for comfort. Human beings trust what aligns. We believe in straight lines, in measured intervals, in structures that repeat without deviation. A grid calms the mind because it suggests predictability, and predictability suggests safety. We draw lines across land, across paper, across thought itself, and call it understanding. But standing before the new image, the one that replaced the earlier poster without explanation, Elias felt something different. Not comfort. Exposure. The composition was stricter now, stripped of the illusion of depth. The valley, the towers, even the mountains had been flattened into disciplined compartments. Everything was contained within borders, framed by thin, unwavering lines. The world was no longer depicted as something continuous, but as something segmented, divided into discrete units that could be isolated, measured, and, perhaps, rewritten. The grid was not behind the image. It was the image. He did not remember bringing this version into the cabin. That fact lingered quietly, like a question he was not yet ready to ask. Instead, he studied the structure. Each panel contained a variation of the same scene: mountains, towers, valleys, but reduced, reinterpreted, constrained by the logic of the grid. Some panels emphasized verticality, others balance, others density. Data replaced texture. Bars replaced depth. Even the mountain itself, ancient and indifferent, had been converted into a shape that could be graphed. It was not art. It was translation. Or perhaps a demonstration. Elias stepped closer. The repetition was not exact. It was iterative. Each panel seemed to test a slightly different configuration, as though the system were exploring possibilities within fixed parameters. A valley rendered as elevation data. A skyline reduced to columns. A horizon broken into segments of value. The world, decomposed, and then recomposed. He felt a slow, almost reluctant understanding begin to take form. The earlier poster had suggested an interface. This one suggested something deeper. Not an interface for observation, but for modification. The thought moved through him carefully, as though aware of its own implications. If the simulation could be rendered in this way, flattened, segmented, parameterized, then it could, in principle, be adjusted. Not by breaking it, not by escaping it, but by altering the relationships between its parts. The grid was not merely descriptive. It was operational. He stepped back, suddenly aware of the room again. The cabin felt smaller than before, though nothing had changed. The walls, the table, the faint hum of the heater, all of it seemed to exist within an invisible framework, as if the grid extended beyond the poster, beyond the image, into the very structure of the space itself. He looked down at his hands. For a moment, they did not feel like objects. They felt like configurations. A collection of constraints holding together in a particular arrangement. Skin, bone, sensation, yes, but also something more abstract. A pattern maintained over time. A continuity that could, perhaps, be expressed differently without being entirely lost. The idea was unsettling. Not because it suggested fragility, but because it suggested flexibility. He turned back to the poster. One panel in particular held his attention. It was simpler than the others. A grid overlaid on a flattened valley, with a series of vertical bars rising from it, some tall, some short, arranged in a sequence that seemed arbitrary at first glance. But the longer he looked, the more the pattern revealed itself. The bars corresponded not to physical structures, but to relationships. Density, activity, flow. Not what was there, but what was happening. The system, it seemed, was not primarily concerned with objects. It was concerned with processes. He felt a quiet shift in his thinking. Human beings had always perceived the world as a collection of things. Trees, mountains, cities, bodies. Objects that persisted, that occupied space, that could be named and categorized. But beneath that perception, reality might be something else entirely. Not things, but events. Not entities, but transitions. A tree is not a thing. It is a process, a continuous exchange of energy, matter, and information. A city is not a structure. It is a flow of movement, communication, and transformation. Even a person is not a fixed object, but a dynamic pattern, constantly updating, never fully the same from one moment to the next. If the simulation operated at that level, if it rendered not objects, but processes, then the grid was not dividing reality. It was revealing it. He felt a strange mixture of clarity and disorientation. To see the world as process is to lose the illusion of permanence. But it is also to gain something else. Continuity. Not the continuity of unchanging existence, but the continuity of becoming. He sat down slowly, his eyes still fixed on the poster. For the first time since the discovery, he felt something close to understanding, not of the system itself, but of how to relate to it. Perhaps the mistake had never been believing the world was real. The mistake had been believing it was fixed. The heater clicked again, a small, mechanical sound that now seemed almost intimate. A reminder that even the simplest systems operate through change. On and off. Expansion and contraction. Input and response. Everything moved. Everything updated. Everything became. He thought again of the flicker in the towers. Of the grid beneath the lake. Of the posters that appeared without clear origin. Each of them had been a moment where the system revealed not its structure, but its activity. A glimpse not of what it is, but of what it is doing. And perhaps, of what it could do. He stood and walked once more to the window. The valley remained as it had always been, vast, cold, indifferent to his thoughts. The towers glowed. The lake reflected. The mountains held their ancient silence. And yet, he could no longer see them as static. Beneath their stillness, he sensed movement. Not visible, not measurable, but undeniable. A constant recalculation. A quiet unfolding of states, each moment giving way to the next, each configuration dissolving into another. The world was not a place. It was a process. And processes, he realized, can be influenced. Not easily, not directly, but subtly, through interaction, through attention, through the choices made within them. He pressed his hand against the glass once more. This time, he did not seek confirmation. He sought participation. For if the simulation was not a prison, but a process, then to live within it was not merely to observe. It was to contribute. Behind him, the grid remained, silent, structured, waiting. Before him, the valley unfolded, dynamic, continuous, alive. And somewhere between the two, Elias began to understand that the discovery of the simulation was not the end of meaning. It was the beginning of responsibility. There comes a point in every realization where knowledge ceases to expand and begins to settle. Not into certainty, but into consequence. Elias felt it not as a thought, but as a quiet shift in the weight of things. The valley had not changed. The cabin still stood at the edge of the frozen shoreline, its small geometry resisting the vastness around it. The trees remained dark and patient. The mountains, indifferent and absolute. Across the water, the city glowed in its vertical stillness, its light folding into the lake with that same trembling duplication, world above, world below, neither entirely stable. And yet, something had moved. Not in the landscape. In him. He stepped outside without hesitation this time, as though the act no longer required justification. The cold met him immediately, precise and undeniable, pressing against his skin with a clarity that felt almost instructional. Sensation, he realized, had become the final anchor, not proof of reality, but proof of participation. He walked toward the lake. The surface was more fragmented than before. Sheets of ice drifted in slow, quiet collision, separated by channels of black water that reflected the sky in sharp, horizontal bands. The colors, cyan, magenta, white, stretched and broke, reorganizing themselves with each subtle movement. It no longer looked like distortion. It looked like reconfiguration. He stopped at the edge. For a long moment, he did nothing. No analysis. No interpretation. No attempt to extract meaning from the scene before him. He simply stood within it, allowing perception to exist without direction. This, he realized, was something he had not done since before the discovery. Even in childhood, observation had always carried an implicit question: what is this? Why does it behave this way? What does it mean? The mind, trained by necessity and evolution, reaches immediately for structure. It organizes, categorizes, reduces. But now there was another possibility: to observe without reducing, to exist within the system without immediately attempting to define it. The thought did not arrive as a conclusion. It arrived as relief. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath dissolve into the air. For the first time since the discovery, the simulation did not feel like a problem to be solved. It felt like a condition to be inhabited. The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. Behind him, the cabin remained, a structure of intention, of human design, of boundaries and containment. Before him, the valley extended outward, uncontained, dynamic, unfolding in ways that no model could fully capture. Between them, he stood. Not as an observer outside the system, but as an event within it. The realization settled into him with a kind of quiet inevitability. If reality is a simulation, then there is no outside from which to observe it. No privileged vantage point from which its totality can be understood. Every act of observation occurs within the system itself, shaped by its rules, limited by its parameters. And yet, observation still matters. Because observation is not passive. It is interaction. He looked down at the water. The reflection met his gaze, fractured but persistent. His form appeared not as a continuous image, but as a series of interruptions, lines, breaks, segments of color that assembled into something recognizable only at a distance. He raised his hand. The reflection responded. Not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently. A correspondence, a relationship. And in that relationship, something subtle revealed itself. The system was not merely generating his experience. It was responding to it. Not in a conscious, intentional sense, not in the way a person responds, but in the way a process adjusts to input. A feedback loop. A continuous exchange between state and perception. He moved his hand again, more slowly this time. The reflection followed, its distortions reorganizing themselves around the motion. It was a simple thing. Almost trivial. But in that simplicity, there was something profound. The simulation was not a fixed sequence of pre-rendered states. It was dynamic, interactive, participatory. He felt a quiet expansion in his chest. Not excitement. Not fear. Something closer to responsibility. If the system responds to interaction, then interaction shapes the system. Not absolutely. Not in a way that allows for control or mastery. But incrementally. Locally. Through the accumulation of choices. He thought of the grid. Of the posters. Of the flickers in the towers. Each of them had been moments where the system revealed its structure. But structure alone is not enough to understand a process. One must also understand how it changes. And change, he realized, is always relational. The system changes because it is interacted with, because it is experienced, because it is, in some sense, lived through. He looked out across the lake toward the distant city. The vertical lights rose into the sky like signals, their reflections stretching downward into the water in long, trembling lines. Above them, the moon hung in its quiet precision, surrounded by a field of stars that no longer felt infinite, but structured, distributed, arranged, part of a larger coherence he could sense but not fully grasp. For a moment, the entire scene seemed to align. Not visually, conceptually. The mountains, the city, the lake, the sky, each of them expressions of the same underlying process. Different scales, different configurations, but part of a single, continuous unfolding. And within that unfolding, him, not separate, not external, embedded. He felt, then, the final shift. Not in understanding, in orientation. The question was no longer, is this real? That question had dissolved, replaced by something more immediate, more grounded. How should one live, knowing this? He closed his eyes briefly. There was no answer waiting. No instruction encoded into the system. No guidance from beyond. Only the present moment, unfolding as it always had. But now it carried a different weight. Not because it was more important, but because it was more visible. He opened his eyes. The reflection shimmered. The ice shifted. The distant lights pulsed softly against the dark. And Elias understood, in a way that did not require articulation, that the discovery of the simulation had not reduced the world. It had revealed its sensitivity, its responsiveness, its openness to influence, however small. Meaning, then, was not something imposed from outside the system. It was something enacted within it. Through attention, through choice, through the quiet, continuous act of being present in a reality that may be constructed, but is no less experienced for it. He lowered his hand. The reflection settled. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. And in that imperfect settling, he saw something he had not allowed himself to see before. Not the architecture, not the code, but the possibility that even within a system, there is room to become. There are discoveries that expand the world, and there are discoveries that reverse it. Elias did not at first understand which kind this was. The light appeared without warning. Not gradually, not like dawn, not like the slow unveiling of something that had always been present. It arrived as interruption, a vertical incision in the continuity of the valley, a column of brightness so precise it seemed less like illumination and more like definition. It did not spread. It did not flicker. It held. From the sky to the earth, a single axis of radiance, cutting through the landscape with a clarity that refused interpretation. He stood motionless. Not because he was afraid, but because movement felt irrelevant in the presence of something so absolute. The body, with all its instincts, flight, reaction, defense, seemed suddenly misaligned with the nature of what was occurring. This was not an event in the world. It was an event to the world. Above the beam, suspended in a geometry that defied familiarity, there was a shape. Circular. Balanced. Too perfect. Not metallic, not organic. Categories that now felt increasingly inadequate, but constructed in a way that suggested intention without revealing purpose. Its edges did not catch the light. They generated it. The structure did not sit in the sky. It seemed to anchor it, as though the space around it had been organized to accommodate its presence. Elias did not think craft. He did not think object. He thought interface. The word arrived with a quiet certainty that unsettled him more than fear would have. Because fear implies distance. And this implied connection. The beam did not burn. It did not distort the air. It simply existed, as though a boundary had been drawn between two layers of the same system, and that boundary had chosen to make itself visible. He took a step forward. The ice beneath his boots shifted softly, a reminder of gravity, of weight, of all the small constraints that had once defined reality. But now those constraints felt local, conditional, rules within a system rather than properties of existence itself. The beam remained unchanged. It did not respond to his movement. And yet, something in him began to respond to it. Not physically, conceptually. A pressure at the edge of thought. As though his mind, accustomed to interpreting experience through familiar structures, was encountering something that did not fit within them. Not because it was too complex, but because it operated at a different level entirely. He tried to name what he was seeing. He failed. And in that failure, something important revealed itself. Language, he realized, is not merely a tool for describing the world. It is a boundary. What cannot be named resists containment. What resists containment begins to alter the one who perceives it. The beam did not explain itself. It did not communicate in symbols or signals. It simply was. And in that being, it demanded a different kind of attention. Not analytical, not interpretive, but receptive. Elias stopped a few steps from the edge of the light. The lake reflected it perfectly, a second column descending into darkness, as though the system extended both upward and downward, neither direction more real than the other. The mountains framed it without reaction. The trees remained still. The distant city, its lights now dim by comparison, seemed almost incidental, a lower resolution layer beneath a higher order process. For the first time since the discovery, Elias felt something like humility. Not the humility of smallness, but the humility of misinterpretation. He had believed, as had all of humanity, that the discovery of the simulation was an unveiling, that once the structure was understood, the system would be, if not mastered, at least contextualized. But this was not unveiling. This was escalation. The system was not static. It was evolving. Or perhaps, revealing itself in stages. The thought unsettled him, because it implied that the discovery had not been the end of ignorance. It had been the beginning of exposure. He looked up at the structure above the beam. For a moment, just a moment, he had the distinct, unshakable impression that it was not merely present. It was attentive, not in the human sense, not observing with intention or curiosity, but aligned, synchronized, as though the system had reached a state in which certain interactions became possible. And he, standing there at the edge of the light, was part of that interaction. The realization did not produce panic. It produced stillness. Because if the system was capable of this, of manifesting interfaces within its own structure, then the question was no longer whether humanity was inside a simulation. The question was whether the simulation had reached a point where it could acknowledge its inhabitants, not as individuals, but as processes, participants, variables within its unfolding. He felt the cold air move through him as he inhaled. The breath was sharp, grounding. And yet, even that sensation now felt like an exchange. Input, output, a cycle. He extended his hand toward the light. Not fully, not enough to touch, but enough to enter its proximity. The beam did not react. But something else did. Not outside. Inside. A subtle shift in perception, as though the boundaries of his awareness had expanded, not outward, but inward, revealing layers of experience he had not previously noticed. Time felt slightly altered, not slowed, not accelerated, but thickened, as if each moment contained more structure than before. He withdrew his hand. The sensation receded. But it did not disappear entirely. It remained, faint but persistent, like an afterimage of something that had not been fully seen. He stepped back. The beam continued, unchanging, uninterpretable, and yet no longer entirely unknowable. Because now he understood something he had not before. The system was not only something to be observed. It was something that could observe. Not in the way humans do. Not through eyes or intention. But through interaction. Through the alignment of processes. Through moments like this, where the boundary between observer and observed becomes unstable. He turned his gaze once more to the lake. The reflection held. But it no longer felt secondary. It felt equal. Two renderings of the same event. Two expressions of the same interaction. Above and below. System and reflection. Input and response. And somewhere between them. Him. Not outside. Not separate. But participating. He felt no revelation. No final understanding. Only a quiet, irreversible shift. The discovery of the simulation had changed what the world is. But this had changed what the world can do. He stood there for a long time, watching the beam, the structure above it, the silent valley holding it all without resistance. And in that stillness, one thought remained, steady and inescapable. The system had not broken. It had opened.